Every object she bought was a desperate attempt to buy back a past that had no price. Before we begin, let me ask you, have you ever carried a guilt so heavy it silenced your entire life? If stories like this speak to you, subscribe and don't miss what's coming. The penthouse was a cathedral of solitude, its walls lined not with saints, but with ghosts. Evelyn moved through it like a curator in her own mausoleum, her footsteps swallowed by the deep pile of the Persian rugs, her presence a silent echo among the gilded frames and polished mahogany. Her face, a study in controlled elegance, was a perfect mask of detachment, but her eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a grief as vast and cold as the city's skyline that stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was a woman who could buy anything, yet she was haunted by the one thing she could never acquire, a second chance. Her latest acquisition had arrived just moments ago, a small, unassuming wooden box her brother, Adrian, had crafted as a child. It sat on a pedestal under a dedicated spotlight, a fragile, insignificant thing surrounded by a king's ransom of art. It was a stark contrast to the gleaming sculptures and masterful paintings that filled her life, and yet, to Evelyn, it was the most valuable object in the room. It was not the craft itself, but the memory it held. The splintered wood, the uneven edges, the clumsy carving of a small, smiling sun. She reached out, her hand hovering above it, a silent tremor running through her fingertips. This was her ritual. The acquisition, the placement, the silent vigil. She would spend hours, sometimes days, simply looking at these objects, trying to siphon the life from them that had long since left her. Each one was a desperate attempt to rewind the clock, to undo the choices that had led her here, to this gilded cage. She saw her life not as a tapestry of triumphs, but as a series of auctions, each bid a silent prayer for a history that would not repeat itself. She was a collector not of art, but of echoes. She remembered the way Adrian's hands had looked, stained with paint and clay, calloused from working with wood. He had never understood their family's obsession with things that could be bought and sold. He only cared about things that could be made. She saw his face in the uneven lines of the carved sun, a ghost of a smile, a flicker of the vibrant soul that had been extinguished too soon. "They just don't get it, Ev," he had said once, his voice full of a gentle, heartbreaking resignation. She had stayed silent, a choice that had cost her more than any object ever could. The penthouse was a place of echoes and silent accusations. The city lights below, a river of fire, seemed to mock her solitude. She had all the beauty in the world, yet she lived in a void. The objects around her were not companions. They were silent witnesses to her immense, unchangeable failure. They were the trophies of a war she had waged against her past, and she was losing. The only sound in the vast space was the soft hum of the air conditioning, a mechanical breath in a room that had no heart. It was in this perfect, sterile silence that a new kind of sound was about to break through. A sound not of acquisition, but of confrontation, a sound that would force her to look beyond the object and into the emptiness within herself. Her grief was a heavy cloak she wore every day, woven from threads of regret and guilt. It was the source of her immense wealth and the reason for her profound loneliness. Her parents, blinded by their ambition, had seen Adrian's art not as a gift, but as a foolish distraction. They had sold his early works for a pittance, dismissing his passion as a child's hobby. Evelyn, who had loved and understood her brother more than anyone, had watched it all happen. She had said nothing, believing her. Silence was an act of survival, a way to stay in her family's good graces. The memories came in sharp, painful flashes. The day Adrian had shown her his first sculpture, a beautiful, clumsy bird made of discarded metal scraps. The joy in his eyes as he held it up for her to see. The disappointment when their father had called it junk and sold it for scrap value. Evelyn had felt the shame on her brother's behalf, but she had kept her mouth shut. The memory was a bitter taste in her mouth, a constant reminder of her cowardice. Her penthouse was the physical manifestation of this trauma. Every object was a monument to a value she had failed to protect. The rare jade vase in the corner, the Ming Dynasty scroll on the wall, they were all incredibly valuable, a testament to her parents' creed that only things of monetary worth mattered. But Adrian's small wooden box, her latest find, was a direct contradiction to that creed. It was worth nothing, and therefore, to her, it was priceless. Her isolation was a choice she had made, a self-imposed punishment. She rarely entertained, and when she did, it was always with a guarded distance. People saw her as the collector, a figure of immense power and mystery. They saw the fortune, the art, the impeccable taste. They did not see the woman who sat alone at night, a glass of untouched whiskey in her hand, staring at a small object that held an entire lifetime of buried pain. They did not see the tears she never shed, the screams she never uttered. The emptiness of the space was a mirror of her soul. She had filled her life with beautiful things, but they had not filled the void. Instead, they had amplified it. The grand piano that stood silent in the corner, the library filled with books she had never opened. These were not her passions. They were the passions of a life she had been too afraid to live. She had become a ghost in her own home, a keeper of treasures she couldn't even enjoy. She found herself wandering through the halls late at night, a solitary figure in a vast, silent museum. She would run her fingers along the smooth, cold surfaces of her acquisitions, as if she could absorb their history, their value, their very essence. But it was a fool's errand. The objects remained just that, objects. They held no warmth, no comfort, no forgiveness. They were a constant reminder of what she had lost and what she could never get back. The silence was the worst part. It was not a peaceful silence, but a roaring void that echoed her regrets. Every tick of the grandfather clock, every gentle breath of the wind outside, seemed to whisper Adrian's name. The stillness was a cage, and she was the prisoner. And then, one afternoon, the silence was shattered not by a sound, but by a presence, a new, unexpected energy that arrived to document the small, insignificant box that held the key to her entire life. The arrival of the archivist, challenge the very foundation of her existence, was a disruption in her meticulously ordered world. He was unassuming, dressed in a simple button-down and jeans, his face open and curious. He was nothing like the fawning art dealers or obsequious consultants she was used to. He didn't look at her, the billionaire, with awe. He looked at the wooden box with a quiet reverence. He saw beyond its mundane exterior, asking questions not about its provenance but about its story. As he set up his equipment, a small camera and a series of soft lights, he spoke with a genuine, unforced enthusiasm. "It's beautiful," he said, not to Evelyn, but to the object itself. He ran his gloved fingers over the uneven carving, a gentle touch that was both professional and deeply personal. "You can see the hand of the maker here, the imperfections. That's where the soul is." His words were a small, sharp stone, dropped into the still water of Evelyn's silence. It was a language she had forgotten. Leo's approach was different. While others would focus on a painting's brushstrokes or a sculpture's form, he seemed to be drawn to the smaller details. The smudged fingerprint on a corner, the faint pencil mark on the underside of a table, the way the light caught a certain imperfection in the wood. He was a detective of emotions, searching for the human story within the object. He was doing for Adrian's work what Evelyn had failed to do, giving it the attention, the respect, and the love it deserved. Evelyn watched him, her usual mask of indifference beginning to crack. His questions were not about value, but about feeling. "Do you know the story behind the carved sun?" he asked, looking at her for the first time with an expression of genuine curiosity. "It's so full of hope." The word hope hung in the air, a foreign concept in her world of sterile acquisitions and dead memories. She found herself unable to answer, a sudden tightness in her throat. For the first time in years, she felt seen not as the wealthy collector, but as the woman standing in the silent museum she had built for herself. He didn't seem to care about her bank account. He cared about the story, the connection, the tiny emotional clues left behind by a boy who was no longer there. He was looking for Adrian, and in doing so, he was finding Evelyn. If this story has already touched you, imagine what's still to come. Subscribe and don't miss the next one. He continued his work, oblivious to the emotional earthquake he was causing within her. He spoke of his own work at the museum, of the joy he found in uncovering the hidden histories of seemingly insignificant objects. He was a man who found beauty in the discarded, the forgotten, the overlooked. He was, in a strange way, a lot like Adrian. The similarity was a painful, beautiful ache in her chest. He paused his work and looked up at her, a small, genuine smile on his face. Sometimes, the most valuable things aren't the ones you pay. Ivor, are they? He said, his voice soft. It was not a question, but a statement of simple truth. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She had spent a lifetime chasing value, only to discover it had been in her hands all along. The very hands she had used to clasp a silent, shameful silence. He then pointed to a hairline crack on the side of the box. I can help with that, he said. It's a small repair, but it needs a delicate hand. The idea of repairing something, physically, mending a broken object that her brother had touched, was a profound and unsettling one. It felt less like a professional task and more like a symbolic act of healing, a chance to fix what was broken in a way she never thought possible. The silence that had defined her existence began to change. It was no longer a void, but a space filled with a new, fragile kind of sound. The quiet click of a camera shutter, the rustle of a notebook page, and the gentle, unassuming voice of a young man who saw not the price tag, but the soul. For the first time, Evelyn felt a flicker of something she had thought was long dead: hope. Leo began working on the wooden box with a quiet dedication. He did not rush, treating the small, cracked object with the same reverence one would a masterpiece. He showed Evelyn the tools he used, explaining the delicate process of restoration, the way a gentle application of glue and pressure could mend a deep-seated fracture. As he worked, he spoke, not of art history, but of the story he was piecing together from the object itself. He spoke of a child who loved to create, a heart that poured itself into simple, tangible things. Evelyn found herself drawn to him, watching his hands, the patient, meticulous movements that mirrored her brother's. She saw Adrian's hands in his, a painful and beautiful echo. This physical act of mending the box became a metaphor for her own emotional state. She felt the cracks in her own facade widening, exposing the raw, unhealed wound beneath. She wanted to look away, to retreat into the safe, silent fortress she had built. But something held her. There, one afternoon, Leo found a small, almost invisible inscription carved on the inside of the box. He carefully pointed it out to her, using a jeweler's loupe. "It's a date," he said, "and some initials." He then looked at her with a gentle, questioning look. "A.W.?" He didn't have to ask the question. Evelyn knew. It was Adrian's initials, and the date was her birthday. A small gift he had made for her, a secret message hidden within the seemingly worthless object. The discovery was a punch to her stomach. She felt a wave of shame and regret wash over her. She had been so blinded by her parents' pursuit of wealth that she had not even seen the most precious gifts her brother had given her. She had been too busy looking for a price tag to see the love. Her silence, her complicity, suddenly felt even heavier. The physical act of restoring the box was forcing her to confront the emotional truth she had buried for decades. Leo, sensing her distress but not understanding its source, offered a simple gesture. He reached out and gently placed the loupe in her hand. "Here," he said, his voice soft. Look for yourself. It's an incredible thing to find. The weight of the object in her hand, the very tool that had revealed her brother's secret message, was overwhelming. She looked through the loop, and in that tiny, magnified view, she saw a lifetime of love she had taken for granted, and a lifetime of pain she had caused. The silence of the penthouse was now a tense, living thing. The air was thick with unspoken truths. Evelyn felt the walls of her perfect museum closing in on her. Every priceless object seemed to whisper a new accusation. The guilt she had tried to bury with her acquisitions was rising to the surface, a relentless tide that threatened to drown her. She began to spend more time with Leo, not just observing but actively participating. He showed her how to mix the special glues, how to apply gentle pressure, how to clean the surface of the wood without damaging it. She found herself focusing on the tangible, the physical act of repair, as a way to avoid the emotional, but the two were inextricably linked. Each mended crack in the box was a new fissure in her emotional armor. The quiet conversations with Leo began to shift. He was no longer just an archivist, he was a gentle confidant. He spoke of his own family, of his love for art, not as a commodity, but as a connection to the human spirit. He saw the world through Adrian's eyes, and that was a world Evelyn had long ago forgotten, a world of creation, of beauty in the broken, of value in the seemingly worthless. The climax was coming, a slow, inevitable march towards a truth she had been running from her entire life. The small box, now nearly restored, held more than just a memory. It held the key to her entire past, a past she would soon be forced to confront in its most raw, painful form. The final stage of the restoration was to polish the box with a soft whisper. Leo handed the cloth to Evelyn. "It's the final touch," he said, his voice quiet. "It's a way of saying goodbye to the broken parts and welcoming the healed ones." The words were a gentle invitation, a hand reaching out to her across a chasm of decades. Evelyn took the cloth, her hand trembling. The act felt monumental, not just for the box, but for her. As she began to polish the wood, her movements slow and deliberate, a memory surfaced with a searing clarity. The day Adrian had confronted their parents about selling his art. He had stood up to them, a fire in his eyes she had never seen before. He had pleaded with them, not for money, but for respect for his work. And Evelyn, standing a few feet away, had remained silent. She had looked at the floor, at the pristine marble, afraid to meet her brother's gaze, afraid to stand up for him. The memory was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. She stopped, polishing, the cloth falling from her numb fingers. "I was there," she whispered, her voice a ragged, broken sound. Leo looked at her, his brow furrowed with concern. "I was there and I didn't say anything." The dam broke. All the guilt, the loneliness, the pain she had buried for a lifetime erupted in a silent, heart-wrenching sob. It was a sound that had never been heard in the perfect, pristine penthouse. Tears streamed down her face, a torrent of grief that had been held back for years. She sank to the floor, her composure completely shattered, the perfect mask of the billionaire a forgotten relic. "They sold his art," she choked out, the words a confession and an indictment. "And he looked at me, and I couldn't." Leo knelt beside her, not saying a word, just offering a steady, comforting presence. He saw her, not as a powerful, detached collector, but as a heartbroken sister. The revelation was a gut-wrenching admission of her deepest, most guarded secret. Her immense fortune was not a symbol of success, but of penance. Every object she had acquired, every priceless piece, was a desperate, failed attempt to atone for her silence. "I tried to buy it all back," she sobbed, gesturing to the priceless works around her. "I tried to give him the value they denied him, but it was just hollow." The river was a mirror, reflecting his failures back at him. Leo, his voice full of a gentle, profound empathy, said, "It wasn't hollow. It was your way of trying to love. him even after he was gone. His words were a balm, a simple, true statement that cut through the decades of self-recrimination. He saw her pain not as a failure, but as a desperate, misguided act of love. This simple act of understanding was more valuable than any of her acquisitions. She finally looked at him, her eyes red and raw. He was the first person to see her without the facade, the first person to understand the truth behind her grand obsession. He had seen the lonely woman, not the powerful billionaire. In his eyes, she found a reflection not of her failures, but of her humanity. The climax was not in a grand gesture, but in this quiet, raw moment of truth. Evelyn was no longer running from her past. She was embracing it, not with guilt, but with grief. The healing had begun, not through the repair of an object, but through the mending of her own fractured heart. The silent screams of her solitude had finally found a voice, and it was a voice that was ready to tell a new story. The days that followed were a quiet and profound shift. Evelyn did not magically become a different person, but the light had changed. The silence of the penthouse was no longer a void. It was a space for reflection. The priceless objects around her were still there, but they no longer felt like a cage. They felt, for the first time, like history, a collection of stories to be shared, not a secret to be hoarded. She called Leo and told him a new idea had been brewing in her mind. She wanted to open a museum, not a museum of her priceless acquisitions, but a museum dedicated to Adrian's work. She had tracked down every piece of art her parents had sold off, every small sculpture, every early painting, every forgotten doodle. She had been acquiring them not to bury them, but to bring them home. Now she would finally give them a home where they belonged, a place where people could see the beauty in his simple art, where his genius would be celebrated, not for its monetary value, but for its heart. The museum would be her final act of penance, but it was also an act of love. It would be a space that would contradict everything her parents had stood for. It would be a celebration of creation over acquisition, of soul over status. It would be a place where the value of an object was measured not in dollars, but in its ability to touch a heart. It would be a place where the story of a boy who made art out of broken things could finally be told. Evelyn's relationship with her collection had changed. She no longer saw them as a means to an end, but as a beginning. The beautiful objects were no longer her ghosts, but her companions on a new journey. She had found a way to honor her brother's memory, not by hiding it, but by sharing it with the world. She had finally understood that the greatest value of all was not in possession, but in connection. Her face, while still holding the lines of a lifetime of pain, now had a softness, a quiet warmth that had not been there before. She still sat alone in her penthouse, but the loneliness was different. It was no longer a cage. It was a quiet space of peace. The wooden box, now fully restored, sat on a small table by her window. It was no longer a source of guilt, but a symbol of a promise kept, a memory honored, and a heart finally mended. She had finally learned the most important lesson of all. You cannot buy back the past, but you can build a new future from the fragments. And in that new future, she was finally free. If this story moved you, you'll find many others here that might change your day. Join us, subscribe, and be part of this journey.